Hey, it's Andy here. We've got a special event going on for the next two shows. It'll be a two-part series with Lab CFTC Director Daniel Gorfine and the UK's Financial Conduct Authority's Nick Cook. Now, in it, we're going to cover AI, fintech, and blockchain. What's cool about it is that Nick has run these hackathons where they've tapped into the best and the brightest in the world to solve some really tough technology problems in like 2 days. So he's going to share some insights that they had from that and much, much more. It's a fun conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it. Part 1 coming up. Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Hey, just a quick reminder, as always, there's an important disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to listen to. And a quick thanks to all of the people out there in the 105 countries that have downloaded the podcast. We greatly appreciate you listening. It's a treat and an honor that you've done so. And by the way, one more thing before we get started. You can send us suggestions via email. So if you use podcast with an S at cftc.gov, you can do that. You can leave comments on many of the outlets that the show is on, like iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play. But we just thought it might be easier for you to use, and have an email address for you to connect with the show. So, if you've got time, drop us an idea or comment. We'll take a look at it and hopefully maybe incorporate it into the show. All right, this week we are so pleased to have on again to co-host my colleague and Lab CFTC Director Daniel Gorfine. Daniel, welcome back. I'm glad we could get you on because you've been so busy over the last few months.
Well, Andy, it's great to be back on with you. And yes, it's certainly been busy for us at Lab CFTC for the early part of this year.
Yeah, what have you been up to? I mean, I know you were out in Silicon Valley, you were up in Boston, you're crisscrossing the country, adding up all those miles. It's really good for that, but Tell me about what you were doing out there in both places.
Sure. So, Andy, we had a chance to talk before about Lab CFTC and our effort to help facilitate market-enhancing innovation, make sure that we as a commission and an agency have the tools and understanding to keep pace with changes in our markets. And one of the ways that we said we're going to do that is to make sure that we're actually going out and meeting with innovators and not making them come to us. So as you just mentioned, we've been really busy with office hours this year. In January, we had an opportunity to head out to the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. We spent a day at Stanford University and then a day where we co-hosted office hours with the San Francisco Fed and met with a number of really great innovative firms when we were out there. And then just recently, we had an opportunity to head up to Boston, and not because I'm a Red Sox fan, but because we had a chance to spend a day at MIT as part of what was called Boston Blockchain Week, and it was a week filled with events and innovative ideas and firms across the Boston landscape at universities and a number of venture capital firms. So really had an opportunity to get out there and make sure we're hearing directly from the innovation community what's going on.
Just really quickly, were there any top themes that just kind of jumped out at you that A, B, C, D, whatever? I mean, besides Bitcoin, because everybody wanted to talk about that, I'm sure, but and I'm kidding. But anything just really jump out at you, Dan?
Well, I think one thing that struck me from the trip to Boston, and again, it was part of Boston Blockchain Week, but the conversation went well beyond, the concept of just Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies themselves. Right. It was really, there was a lot of talk about how some of these emerging kind of distributed ledger technologies can really, in the long run, have an impact on infrastructure and essentially the plumbing of how we engage in a range of economic transactions and activities. So kind of a very forward-looking, futuristic view of how we would engage in commerce and other types of financial markets activity. So that really struck me. I think the other area that seems to be of increasing relevance in capital markets is around machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Right.
There's just so much happening here with the advances in computing power in our ability to start making more sense of all of that so-called big data that's out there. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see that as a very common thread or theme going forward in the fintech world.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that's certainly getting played out not only in fintech, but across all of the sectors of the economy as these just huge troves of data are out there. Not all of it is easy to access, but certainly that's the wish, the hope, the goal for everyone who's involved with this stuff is to try to make sense with it. Hey, let me just switch gears for a second. I saw that Lab CFTC is requesting some public input to gather ideas and topics for innovation competitions to advance the agency's fintech goals. Dan, how's this going to work? What are the goals for this thing? That sounds really fun.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. We're incredibly excited about this. So this is what we're effectively doing is crowdsourcing from the public ideas, substantive ideas, so topics for innovation competitions that we have the authority to run under something called the Science Prize Competition Act. But stepping back, so why are we doing this? I said at the outset, one of the primary goals of Lab CFTC is to make sure that we're facilitating market-enhancing innovations, that we understand those innovations, and that we can potentially incorporate some of those innovations to make us or our markets more effective and efficient. And one of the key tools that we have to do that is this Innovation Competition Authority under the Science Prize Competition Act. So instead of us, though, just jumping out there and saying we know what the competition should be on, we thought it would make a lot more sense to reach out to the general public and say, if you have thoughts or ideas as to what those topics should be and how we should go ahead and structure our competitions, please share that with us, because that's something that will be publicly available through our comment system and can help inform our subsequent competitions.
Yeah, so I think that's great on two fronts. One is that you're asking the public for ideas about what the competition should be instead of telling people what it is, which anybody who's involved in seen governments over the years, that too often that's the impression that people have, that government just tells them instead of asks for their input, which is the best way of doing it. But the second thing is, it's like, so when you're talking about this competition, I'm putting forward my own thing here. I would love to see some data visualization for the stuff that we put out there, maybe like on the COT or commitment of traders or whatever, interest rate swap stuff that we get. Could it be along those lines?
Yeah, so Andy, you got to give a good read to the request for public feedback, because you're actually identifying one of the areas that we think may be ripe, and so what we did, and folks can access the the request for public feedback on our website. But what we did is we flagged a few areas that we thought looked interesting and promising as areas that we could hold a competition. But we want to get feedback. We want to know what people think of those ideas and others. But specifically to the one that you just mentioned, I mean, look, we as a commission put out a fair amount of public data, and there's an open question of whether innovators could look at that data that we're providing, think about other publicly available data sets that perhaps could be merged with our data, and imagine that we can put out data visualization tools that help to explain and educate to the general public, how our markets work and what they stand for and how they enhance and assist the broader economy. But we also flag, Andy, a couple of other topics that we think are really interesting. One of them is the idea that we have these notice and comment platforms where the public can comment on rulemakings and other types of requests. And we started thinking, are there analytic tools that could be built on top of notice and comment platforms that could perhaps help with analysis and help to pull out common threads or themes, for example? That's another area that we think is really interesting. And then finally, another one that I think is getting more attention in the so-called RegTech community, and this is the idea that you can use technology to enhance compliance as well as regulatory oversight, is if we could actually tag our rule books to make them machine readable. Wow. And if we're able to do something like that, it could assist, certain types of compliance platforms that would be able to run through our rule books in rapid fashion to determine whether certain types of market activity actually trigger certain regulatory requirements. So, you could think of that as the robo rule book idea.
Right. And I'm just thinking, because I know some of the stuff that's come out of the Lab CFTC. So full disclosure, people out there, I don't read everything that comes out of the Lab CFTC. It's amazing, but I do have other job here as the chief market intelligence
We'll forgive
officer.
Give you a little bit of a pass, Andy.
But I think I saw something that you guys are doing called the RFCA project. Is that along those lines where you're talking about RegTech?
Oh, so what you're referring to, and look, so that's actually out of the UK. So the Financial Conduct, so the UK's Financial Conduct Authority has been, a real leader around engagement with fintech and RegTech. And actually, to this end, you asked what we've been up to earlier this year. Just a few months ago, the CFTC announced a fintech cooperation arrangement with the UK's Financial Conduct Authority for us to be able to work together on fintech and RegTech related efforts. And so we certainly are looking closely at some of the great work that the FCA has done in the RegTech area, specifically looking at things like competitions that they've previously launched. And in fact, in just a few weeks, I'm going to be heading over to London for their next hackathon or TechSprint, where they're going to have competitors thinking about financial crimes and anti-money laundering and how we can enhance compliance there.
Well, Dan, you're interesting, but I'd like to talk to the guy that's running that. That sounds really cool. Who's that person?
Yeah, so Andy, actually, so Nick Cook is the head of RegTech over at the FCA. He's really, again, one of the global leaders in thinking about RegTech and how regulators can engage and perhaps enhance some of those innovations. So he's the guy that we would want to talk to.
Well, sounds like I guess we should have on. Why don't we just give him a call and see if he's available?
We can dig up his number. I think that sounds like a great idea.
All right, let me get him. Let me see if I can track him down.
All right.
Hello, Nick Cook.
Hi, Nick. It's Andy Bush and Daniel Gorfine.
Hi there. How are you?
Hey, we're doing really good.
Nick. Good. Hi, Daniel.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Cook works for the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. And for those of you who don't know, the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, is the conduct regulator for 58,000 financial services firms and financial markets in the UK, and the prudential regulator for over 18,000 of those firms. Now, Nick leads the FCA's RegTech activities, which includes the FCA's TechSprint events, the first events of its kind convened by a financial regulator, so well done. And he is also responsible for creating the FCA's Analytics Center of Excellence to drive the organization's use of data science and machine learning and artificial intelligence. So, Nick, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Hey, give us an overview, Nick, of about the work that you have led at the FCA on RegTech.
Sure. So our RegTech work started about 2.5 years ago. And the early phase of the work sounds quite benign now, but the early phase was basically changing the way in which we engaged with different parts of the market about technology. So we spent a lot of time early on meeting a whole group of entities that we as a regulator wouldn't normally interact with, so technology companies, a lot of startups, a lot of academics, a lot of consultancies, to really try and understand what kind of modern and novel technologies were being developed and how they might be applied initially to compliance processes. So we're focusing on how technology could help firms meet their compliance requirements. And as we started to do that work, one of the questions we had in the back of our mind was really, what's the best role for us to play as a regulator in this space? And the feedback that we got was pretty clear, that really the roles that people wanted us to play were to continue to be a really engaged and active participant in this kind of burgeoning new ecosystem, to be available to discuss these technologies, to meet and understand what was happening. B, to use our kind of authority as a public body to bring groups together around common problems and common issues, and to see what role new technologies could play in addressing those. And that's where the TechSprint or kind of hackathon events came from. And then the third one really was that there was a lot of desire for us to demonstrate that we were genuinely interested in these technologies by exploring how we might apply them to our own processes. So probably the last year or so, we've started to focus a bit more on that side of things, looking at how we can apply machine learning, AI, natural language processing, those sorts of technologies within the FCA. So I guess a bit of a mix of engagement, focus work, these big TechSprint events, and then experimentation internally on how we can use them. that will be an overall summary of what we've done.
Was there a bit of skepticism when you first got started doing this, when you started to engage? Because you're the regulator, and I know for Dan and I, having gone through some of this process ourselves, the people look at us and they go, should we bring our lawyer, right? Did you have some of that?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there were some firms for whom us saying, "Oh, tell us what you're experimenting with," was just a really uncomfortable opening line, frankly. Yeah, we definitely saw that. I think the other thing we saw was some parts of the market thinking we would show interest for a period of time and then we would disappear again. So I think they sort of thought this might be a passing fad or a passing interest of ours rather than something we were genuinely committed to exploring longer term.
Yeah. So
yeah, we definitely saw that early on.
Yeah. So Nick, I was just talking to Andy about the great work that you all have done. And, I have to say from the U.S. perspective, the FCA and a lot of the work that you've done on RegTech and competitions, has served as a really great model for many of us to look at and see what we can learn from. But let me actually switch over to what you just mentioned, the TechSprint. And, I'm heading over to London shortly for your next TechSprint, which I believe is on the topic of financial crimes and anti-money laundering. So share with us a little bit more of what to expect from that. What are some of the outputs and what is that event shaping up to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for your kind comments, Daniel. The TechSprints, so they are, by any other name, they are a hackathon type event. They're slightly different, and I'll explain how, but they broadly feel like the kind of hackathons that you see across the technology market generally. And the point of these events is quite multifaceted, really. One of the intents behind it is that we, as a regulator, give some visibility. We shine a light on a set of issues or problems where we feel some collaborative technology-enabled innovation could make some progress. So part of it is to basically say this is a topic that we care about and that we feel some progress could be made if some of these modern technologies were deployed. The second purpose behind it is that by bringing a really multidisciplinary, diverse group together, we get a learning opportunity as a regulator. So we get to see kind of what's happening in the market and what some of these technologies mean in practice and how firms could deploy them, but also some of the challenges that firms are likely to experience in attempting to use them. So we get a really good learning experience, and I would hope, and certainly the first 4 tech sprints that we've hosted, the feedback has echoed this. I would hope it also provides an opportunity for the participants to learn about the technologies, about the problems that the technologies are trying to solve. And through bringing everyone together in a kind of collaborative, fairly high energy, intense environment, what you also see is the development of a lot of new connections between different parts of the market, whether that be the regulated entities or the unregulated participants, but a lot of new networks and connections that are built. And then really what you're aiming for is some nuggets of good ideas, some new thinking, which is effectively the product of the diverse intellectual capital that comes together for those tech sprints. So some new thinking about how you might go about solving some of these, in many cases, long-standing, seemingly intractable problems. So we hope that the events kind of create the environment where you start to see some of that.
What I love about that is, and Dan, I know you've experienced this as well, but it's fun to be a regulator. I know that sounds really dorky, but it's fun to be a regulator when you can do these things, because when you do bring people together, or if you have meetings with them and you demonstrate that this is beneficial not only for them and for you, but you have something of value here that you can help them with. And I think we're all in the business of promoting healthy, efficient, competitive, financially sound markets. And so when you bring people together, have those conversations in an environment where they feel like they can trust you, that you're not going to slam the hammer down on them, the world opens up, doesn't it? I think for me, in the meetings I've had, and I don't, Dan, you do a ton of these things, and maybe you could just share a little bit, Dan, about because we talked about Boston and Silicon Valley when you were out there, but I think that's the really exciting part of the work that you're doing, Nick, and that Dan's doing and I'm doing, is that bringing people together, getting them to share some of their ideas about what their problems are, the things that they're trying to solve, and then, understanding that they're not alone out there, that other people are trying to do the same thing.
No, I think, Andy, that's absolutely right. And I think that part of the value proposition has to be, two-sided. One is that we obviously as regulators benefit from seeing and learning and then potentially incorporating some of these promising technologies. But on the flip side, we're hopefully providing valuable feedback to the innovators themselves. And I will say one particular area, and I'd love to get Nick's thoughts here, is on the topic of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is a very kind of hot topic right now. And we've seen over time, every 10 years or so, if you look, there's a new enthusiasm for the concept of artificial intelligence. But it seems like today we're starting to live up to at least some of the potential. And a lot of that, I think, is driven by increases in computing power and the ability, as we were talking about earlier, Andy, to actually do more with all the data that's available out there. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's a particularly ripe topic or substantive area for regulators to be engaging with innovators. But let me turn that over to Nick, because Nick, I know you all have been doing a fair amount of thinking about machine learning and how that can kind of move the needle in terms of RegTech, compliance technologies, and then even on the regulatory side, kind of oversight and surveillance technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would echo your points that the point of bringing everyone together is partly that we get to learn collectively how some of these technologies could be used, and some of the risks and opportunities that they present to us. I expect there will be a fairly significant focus on machine learning and AI-backed technologies at this financial crime TechSprint that we've got coming up, and I think we're starting to some extent change our stance a bit on the extent to which we engage with the market about some of the consequences and some of the considerations in using these technologies. So we had an event about 4 or 5 weeks ago now where we basically opened the door to industry participants to come together and talk about, what are some of the ethical considerations for machine learning in financial services? What do we really mean by explainable AI in a financial services context? How do machine learning models interact with our kind of established understanding of governance and management frameworks within the industry? And how do we collectively undertake the human learning that is probably needed in order for us to more fully deploy machine learning within our institutions? And I think we can see there are a myriad of opportunities for regulators in terms of deploying some of these technologies, and they do range from the somewhat more benign opportunities to automate manual processes, which, don't get me wrong, is not at the most kind of glitzy, exciting end of machine learning and AI, but it's still really helpmore. It's still really useful. And useful on a number of fronts. Useful in that we could probably do things more efficiently and at a more effective cost. But at the same time, we can remove some of the less inspiring, less exciting parts of people's jobs and automate those out and free them up to focus on far more interesting, far more value-adding activities. So you've got kind of automation at one end, and then as you rightly point out, Daniel, that we've got much more access to much more affordable high power computing than we ever had before. At the same time, the world is producing data at a rate that we've never seen before. So you've got these 2 or 3 things coming together at the same time that the open source community is really burgeoning. And that's kind of creating this really rich environment for experimentation in machine learning. So I think we see lots of opportunities in automation. We see opportunities to move from a kind of sampling-based view of the world, which is the only thing you can really do when you're relying on human resource, to a kind of population-based view of the world, where you are actually looking at all of the information and extracting insight from that. And I think the final area we see real opportunities to move from being reactive. A lot of regulators are naturally reactive, making decisions based on historic data, to being far, far more proactive and predictive in our analytical capabilities as a result of using some of these machine learning techniques.
All right, that's the end of the first part of a two-part series that we're doing with the UK's Financial Conduct Authority's Nick Cook and, of course, Lab CFTC Director Daniel Gorfine. Next week, part 2, we'll get into AI, blockchain, and a whole bunch of other fintech stuff. I hope you tune back in and check it out. I'm Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. You've been listening to CFTC Talks. Thanks so much. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.